specificity with which we do it and the maturity with which we're doing it. So it's not either shallow, predictable, inappropriate. So I'm just trying to say, look for strong exegetical links that are either New Testament controls, well-documented biblical theological themes, kingdom, covenant, wilderness, temple, or look for typology. But notice today I ended up on typology, but through the door of a New Testament control. Yeah. Jesus as the Son of Israel, the Son. I felt better about a New Testament control than just simply deciding I'm going to do Jesus this way this week. But some of us, when we preach Christ, we're kind of like the Poxitani Phil preacher. You know what Poxitani Phil is? He's that little groundhog comes up out, and if he sees a shadow, it's 6 weeks or more of the same. I mean, some of our people, they sit down, by the time we start preaching, they're like, oh man, I already know where he's going. This is 6 weeks more of the same. I go to Poxitani Phil, First Baptist Church. And so we need greater variance, greater breadth, greater sophistication. We need a lot of work on how to preach Christ well, not merely trying to do Christ from every text.
Any other additional thoughts on this, guys?
Yeah, I want to hop in here. David, you used a phrase very intentionally, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but I think I have at least half of it right. You said, you're not looking for Christ in this passage, you're looking to get to Christ from this passage. Now, there are some Old Testament passages where you can look in that passage and see something that's obviously Christological. Most, you're looking to Christ. And there's a massive distinction between the two because in our circles, especially when you begin to talk about, say, redemptive historical preaching, which we appreciate much about, I appreciate much about, there is a strand within that says you're really not doing the Old Testament justice and you're not doing Christ justice unless you find Christ in every passage. You very intentionally went away from that in what you were explaining today.
Yeah, it just reminds me of the little picture book, Where's Waldo? And we kind of open up the New Testament and look for that little red and white hat. Oh, I got Jesus, so now I'm going to do Jesus. And I think we need to ask different kinds of questions. What is the relationship of my text to the fullness of the promises in Christ? How is my text altered in its understanding based on my understanding of the gospel? So I just think we need a lot of work on preaching Christ well. We've given 15 years to preaching Christ. We need to just keep growing. I'm intentionally even moving toward with what specificity are we preaching Christ? So that little Bullmore diagram is interesting. Or from the New Testament, the Old Testament is anticipating, but the New Testament is applying the fullnesses of those promises. So the New Testament, it's what dimension are they picking up on regarding the ministry of Christ, and then how are they applying the gospel from that text? We're just not real good at that yet. I'm hoping we will be in 10 years.
Any additional thoughts? Brian, Mark, John? No. On that, so if there are guys who are sitting here hearing some of these things, maybe this is new to them, any books that you would suggest reading to kind of think further, more carefully on this, that you guys have found helpful?
On the topic of preaching Christ?
Preaching Christ, thinking through the role of biblical theology in our preaching.
Yeah, I mean, I could point to a number. One I think is very helpful is Sidney Greidanus's. I mean, not just one book, many books that he's written on this topic. Those are very helpful. As far as one particular preacher, I would probably point that direction. Of course, I do quibble things that he advocates. But as far as just generally in the main or a source you can look to, I think especially how he encourages the reader to engage typology without, in essence, making each one of us, to just go to the extent of our own imagination, but actually some helpful guardrails there. His 7 ways, where he unpacks, the way of analogy and the different longitudinal themes that runs out. I think he does a very good job with that.
Yeah.
I get real scared, honestly, here, just amongst us friends. I get real worried when I see people preach in ways where the meaning of the text is found somewhere other than the text itself. And with the meanings up here floating around somewhere, that just sends off alarm bells in my head. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What's the name of the Ed Clowney book? Not the biblical preaching, but is it Unfolding Mystery? Or
yeah, I think that's it.
The Mystery of Christ? There's a beautiful example.
You're talking about the little blue book, the little blue
No,
paperback?
that's biblical preaching.
Okay.
That's good. This is where he's actually doing it in his preaching, and it's a fairly short book. It's longer than that one, but it's called The Unfolding Mystery or The Unfolding Christ by Edmund Clowney. He was the president of Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia for years. One of the best preachers of biblical theology I've ever heard. Very legitimate, finding Christ from the text. And I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name of the book, The Unfolding Mystery.
We can find it.
Brian Chappell's book, Christ-Centered Preaching, actually talks about this. He has some good kind of guardrails in the end of his book. Michael Lawrence's book on biblical theology for the pastor.
Yeah, and look,
Yeah.
there's a balance there we have to maintain, and I don't want to dominate the panel here today, but look, we are Christian preachers.
Yeah.
We are Christian preachers. We ought to preach the Old Testament very much unlike the way we would hear a Jewish rabbi teach the Old Testament.
Right.
And my point is, I want to just drive home here, is there are ways to do that, to preach Christ from the Old Testament that are very faithful, that does not force one or lead one to compromise the actual meaning of the text itself in the Old Testament, but draw interpretive lines to the new, to the cross, to Christ.
Yeah. Even just reading the book of Hebrews, I'm preaching through Hebrews right now, and it's been so sweet. I mean, even thinking about Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to things that were spoken later. And I mean, just line after line after line showing how the Old Testament is pointing forward to and fulfilled in Christ. It's just a wonderful treatment of that in the Scriptures itself.
Speaking of the Scriptures themselves, two other things that are useful tools. If you make a practice of reading the whole chapter of the Old Testament, whenever you see a New Testament quoting the Old Testament, even just a phrase or a verse, go back and read the whole chapter, because that context is what was being referenced by that New Testament author. And the people hearing it in the first century may have been much more familiar with it than you are or I am. So if you go back and you read that, you might begin hearing resonances that the author actually intended. And because there were no chapter and verse divisions, they didn't mean just chapter 26, verse 13. I mean, they meant that section of Isaiah. So you go back and you read that, just make that a discipline. And on the other hand, I've also gone in some of my copies of the Bible, and I've marked every place in the Old Testament that I see a text dealt with in the New Testament. So in the New Testament, our Bibles are very good about giving us where they're quoting from in the Old Testament, but I don't know why Bible publishers don't tell you where the New Testament deals with the Old Testament, in the Old Testament. When you're reading the Old Testament, so I always just mark it in a red pen. This is, what, Paul quotes in his sermon here in Acts 14 or something. So that every time I'm reading the Old Testament, I'll realize, hey, there's an inspired commentary on this. And I can go to the New Testament, read it. So why people don't put that in study Bibles, I don't have any idea.
Carson's commentary on the Old Testament.
Yeah,
the New
Carson
Testament
and Beale, Greg Beale and Don Carson did a commentary on the New Testament use of the Old. That's superb. It's pretty technical. It's large and expensive, but it's really good.
Yeah. Brother, another thing I appreciated on your talk was just talking about how moving from exegesis, we're not done yet. We need to move through theological reflection into having a sermon outline. For me, that's one of the challenges in sermon prep is just, I can see what the text is saying, but how am I going to communicate this? How am I going to preach this? How am I going to apply this? So any wisdom for us on moving from an exegetical outline to a homiletical outline, things that have been helpful for you in that?
I guess there's a few things I want to say, but I want to be brief. So sermon prep requires exegesis. It requires theological reflection. It requires synthesis. A lot of us think we're ready to preach if we've done our exegesis and we actually think through clearly how we're going to talk about Jesus today or what impact this, and we think we're ready to preach. For me, that last line, that's a full day's work. That's a full day's work to do the synthesis. I can't shortcut it. The other thing I would say, though, is your structural work should shape your sermonic outline work. The organization of the material, with its emphasis, should generally shape your preaching material. And if you do that, then you don't have to work so hard. You're not looking for outlines. You're looking to discern your context in a way that you can communicate its outline for the people you're talking to.
Yeah. Any additional thoughts, guys?
No, I'll just say, again, when I got to the point in preaching ministry where I got over the hang up to have a polished, outline, was a very liberating season of ministry to enter in. I mean, I just spent anguish in my early years of pastoring trying to make this outline pop. When one day I realized, I really don't have to spend that much time sweating alliteration. I think I can, as long as I'm faithfully communicating the meaning of the text in this outline, I think we're okay.
John, any thoughts, brother? No? Nope. All right, guys. We have about 10 minutes. Just any questions for Dave or any of the guys in the panel? Yep, right here in the front or in the middle, I guess. Give us your name and church.
My name is Chris from First Baptist Church in Hennessy, Oklahoma. Just curious, each one of you, if you wouldn't mind sharing when you start working on Sunday, your sermon for Sunday, and then how long that process takes for you.
I take Mondays off. Tuesday is all meetings, counseling, staff, etc. And then Wednesday, I'll start looking at the text, but I also have meetings on Wednesday. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, mostly I'll start my main exegetical work on Wednesday, and then I'll actually meet with a group of guys on Thursday, think through application and just the outline together. And then I'll start writing it Thursday afternoon, Friday, and Saturday. So I usually spend about 30 hours on a sermon. Dave?
The first step for me is with our staff. We read the text together 3 or 4 weeks in advance of the preaching, and we ask simple questions of the text. How is it organized? What is the emphasis revealed as a result of that? So that's my first look. And then, so like Monday before I got on a plane, I was starting the preparation for what is 3 weeks later. Last week I was away, and so I brought this week's sermon. So at nights I'm working on that. I brought it again with me this week. So even last night, taking a look at what's coming. So for me, it's usually from 3 weeks in, I'm starting to germinate pretty solidly.
So you're cooking 3 sermons in your head at any given point?
Sure.
John?
Wednesday mornings with a few of the young guys in my church, I'm doing from about 8 a.m. until noon. We're doing the exegetical work, not for the one that I'm going to preach, but for 2 weeks out. So that's the one way that I found that I can get ahead is by bringing somebody else in to make sure that we actually do that work. And then, so my prep starts on Wednesday, and then from like 2 o'clock until 5 o'clock, I'll work that week, and then all day on Thursday, and then about 3 or 4 hours on Saturday.
Friday morning, if it's a shorter text, in the original language is where I begin, and I'll finish on Sunday morning when I step into the pulpit.
Right.
Depends on the week and what my given tasks are for that week, so it changes. I try to have Tuesdays and Fridays for the bulk of my work on a sermon, and I usually finish Sunday morning. So I'm usually in the office at about 5 or 6 a.m.
Well, it ends for me literally when the sermon's done. But there are times when I'm preaching point number 1 or 2, and there's something back here rattling around about point number 3. It better not be like, what does the text mean? It better be like it better be an insightful word of application that just the Lord gave me in the moment. My life is kind of a BC and AD. BC when I pastored is my primary vocational responsibility, and obviously AD here serving the institutional context. The BC era pastoring, I would begin Tuesday morning and just kind of marshal my way through the week. David, just one quick question. You said you spend a day synthesizing. What do you mean by synthesizing?
So synthesis is the taking of 2 or more things and creating a third thing, and that's coherent. So for me, it's synthesizing is taking the exegetical work, the historical, grammatical work, taking the theological reflection, which is not only biblical theology, systematic theology, historical theology, just thinking about that, and then actually moving from that exegetical and theological moment to a third thing, which is a sermon. So that's, for me, the headers for me are, what argument am I going to make this week from this text? What is the arrangement of the material in this week? What is the application or the implications for my people? What is the makeup of the audience to whom this will be preached? Because that's a major contributor too. And so those four things are, for me, what sermon writing is. And that's what I mean by synthesis.
If we want to read about that, we can read about it in the book, Expositional Preaching, little orange book.
You can.
Okay. Next question. Right there. Yep. Name and church.
My name is Seth. I'm from Paola, Oklahoma. I'm a pastor there. Several of you have mentioned that at some point during your preparation, you are involving other people. How does the involvement of like young men or other people work in your particular context? Is that a good idea for a young pastor? How has that improved you as a preacher, as a minister of the gospel? Is that something that every pastor should do, or is it just particular to your context? Does that make sense?
Yep.
I know, Mark, you've talked about you have sermon reviews on Sunday nights, and they help you, but during the actual planning of the message, you said you meet with other staff members. I think you said you meet with some young men.
Yep, got it. So role of involving other people in sermon prep, benefits, pros, cons, and that. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a category more of preference than of conviction. I like to be alone on preparing sermons. If I'm involving someone else, that's interpreted as meaning they're interrupting me, and I like to be alone. I know Mark likes to have a stereo of noise and people around talking because he's wired differently. But for me, when my wife says to me something like, "What are you preaching on Sunday?" and I can give a quick answer that's like a one-sentence distilled, here's what the text on, here's what I'm preaching on, that's like a big victory in my heart. That means I've moved the ball a long ways down the field that I can give a quick answer as to what the text is about and what, therefore, I'm preaching on. Now, it takes me a day to get that point. Again, Mark said he can do like 30 of those in a day and foreshadow them in print for 6 months and all that, but I'm immortal.
Did you say you're immortal?
No, I said I'm a mere mortal.
It really depends on who's available, but if there are people available, I do like to talk about the text with them. Christians generally have helpful thoughts about the Bible, and that can improve. Well, no, I mean that can improve how I'm thinking about it, and benefit the application and even insight, or even just questions that people might have about the text. It might be something I'm not even thinking about. It's just always helpful. So I just think it's always helpful if people can be involved in it.
I think I'm wired like Dr. Allen is, but I've benefited from including other people in it, because I think Brian's right. I think they ask questions that you weren't thinking. They bring observations that you weren't seeing. They think of applications that you weren't. I mean, it just helps you broaden your application, I think, as well. For me, I think I think all of us probably have a rhythm of sermon prep. I think having that meeting set up every week for me acts as accountability. Like, I know I have to have my homiletical outline done by Thursday morning. So for me, that's helpful. So because I'm going to meet with those guys, and I'm expecting them to have theirs done. So there's just certain checks in the week that are helpful for me. So
for me, it's at the start of the process.